epistemic content. This is my research on metaphysics, epistemology, and semantics and their interaction. And Frege, he raised the question of the epistemic value of identity statements such as Hesperus is identical with Phosphorus, and it started all this. So I will talk about belief ascription and how Robert Stalnaker thinks about that. Then I'll bring in Saul Kripke and with his puzzle about belief on inconsistent beliefs. And I'll go back to Stalnaker, how he handles the problem of knowledge of identity, and then I'll lay out my theory. So Robert Stalnaker, he talks about, he used the term belief content, but doxastic content. I'd say that's roughly the same thing. So let's say Peter believes that Hesperus is identical with Mars, and we all know that it's not the case. So Peter has a false belief because Hesperus is identical with Venus, and Venus is not Mars. And on the metaphysics of identity, that identity is necessary. So given the Hesperus is identical with Venus and not Mars, so necessarily Hesperus is identical with Mars is false. It's necessarily false. So the belief that Peter has is false of all possible worlds. So if we, on the possible world semantics, the content of Peter's belief is a set of no possible worlds. But it seems that his belief carries some information, and information we use possible worlds, alternatives ruled out to characterize. So there seems to be a puzzle here. And Stalnaker asks, we have to think about what the world might be like for Peter when he, with that belief, what the world is like for him. So Stalnaker's pragmatic strategy with the name of two-dimensionalism, afterwards the metasemantic interpretation, it goes like this. So counterfactually, Mars occupies Hesperus' actual astronomical position in the evening. Well, given how Hesperus, how that name came about in actuality, let's say Mars instead of Venus occupies that position. So we have a behaviorally indistinguishable naming ceremony because the ancient people, they do the same naming, and the behavior is all the same. It's just that we don't, at that time, behavior doesn't distinguish what object it was that's being named. So in that world, Hesperus is identical with Mars. Well, given that it's Mars that occupies that position in the sky, so when uttered counterfactually, that sentence uttered in that world, it would have asserted a counterfactual truth. It would have asserted a truth in that counterfactual world. So that's one way in which we would think that Peter's belief is true in the counterfactual world, but that the truth is, because given the semantics of Hesperus in the actual world, it is not true in the counterfactual world. But counterfactually, that sentence would have, were it to be uttered in that counterfactual world, it would have expressed a truth. So that's the pragmatic strategy. And there's one more complication because let's say Paul and Mary, we both know that Hesperus is identical with Venus, but not Mars. So unlike Peter, we know more and without that false belief. So that counterfactual world in which Hesperus occupied. That position does not belong to the pragmatic context. When we have a conversation, it's that counterfactual world is not a live option. And to talk about the doxastic context of Peter, because we're talking about Peter's belief, we bring in epistemic possibility of Hesperus. So there might be a world in which that object that's occupying that position is Mars. So for Peter, when he sees Hesperus in the evening, he will point there and say that's Mars. So that's what the world is like for Peter. But for us, for Peter, for Paul and Mary, they will say that's not Mars. So there's how it's different. And in the hope that if Peter is there, their utterance would have ruled out WC, the counterfactual world, in virtue of their utterance, and to update Peter about what the world is like. So that's Stalnaker's theory, simply put. And now there's Kripke, direct reference, direct referentiality. That reference of names, at least, are not mediated by something like description or sense. So let's say Peter sincerely assents to Phosphorus is the second planet from the sun, while Hesperus is not the second planet from the sun. It's a doxastic fact that Peter, it's possible of the psychology that he sincerely assent to both of these sentences. But then these sentences on some version of direct referentiality, co-referential names are substitutable, preserving truth value. So if I were to substitute, let's say, Phosphorus with Hesperus, then these sentences would be contradictory, because now saying Hesperus is the second planet from the sun and Hesperus is not the second planet from the sun, so there's a contradiction. And it seems that direct referentiality would encounter this problem. And of course, besides in terms of contradictory sentences, we are focusing on belief, right? So propositional attitude. We need something more, which is the disquotationality. Sincere assent to a sentence entails belief in its disquoted content. It's arguable what the disquoted content is, whether a disquoted content is still, well, of course, the orthodox is that it's the truth condition, but then if it's in a belief or in a belief context or a doxastic context, is it that simple? Let us ignore that, and let's say that this quoted content is simply the truth condition, and given the truth conditions are the truth makers are, let's say, fact, and fact constitute possible world. So the contradictory beliefs would have the following content, which is Venus is the second planet from the sun, and Venus is not the second planet from the sun. And that's a problem, because then the beliefs are contradictory. So typically when someone is very good at logic and tease out the consequences of one's beliefs, one would not be having contradictory beliefs. Of course, you could have inconsistent beliefs without teasing out the consequences, but let's say Peter is a supreme logician, but he could have still committed that mistake and formed both beliefs about Hesperus and Phosphorus, one being the second planet from the sun and the other being not the second planet from the sun. So again, for Kripke, it poses a question, a problem, a puzzle. And to push the point even further, we can think about the identifying description. So Hesperus and Phosphorus, they're Venus differently identified, because they are well, when Venus is associated with the properties of being the astronomical object occupying certain position in the evening sky, then that property in contrast to occupying some other position in the morning sky, that's when we receive, well, at least for Peter, the information received through the names. They are information about the same object, but they are received through different names. And even so, but to point out that the puzzle does not support something like a descriptivism or does not counter direct referentiality, notice that even if a Peter were to receive information about Venus through the name Hesperus and the name Phosphorus independently as an astronomical object observable from Earth, that's a fact. That's what Venus is, without any other distinguishing property, because we could have just known, like the physicist, like Richard Feynman. He's a physicist. We don't have to have a uniquely identifying description in order for a use of the name to refer. So we could have a description that's not uniquely identifying or even distinguishing. So, but still form the belief that Hesperus is the second planet, but Phosphorus is not the second planet, even if the associated identifying properties are, well, they are the same property, being the astronomical object observable from Earth. So even if we reduce the information received, there's still that same doxastic effect. It's still possible that Peter be in that position. So there's a problem, and how it doesn't motivate something like a descriptivism. And I'll go back to Stalnaker and talk about knowledge of identity, the necessary posteriori. That's something that Kripke discovered. So Hesperus is identical with Phosphorus. That's something that we know as a fact, and it's a fact in all possible worlds because of the metaphysics of identity. But it is a piece of empirical knowledge. We knew that through astronomical discovery. So given that we have the acquired evidence to know that Hesperus is identical with Phosphorus, so it's informative, and the informativeness is constituted by the alternatives ruled out. So how informative the amount of information is measured by the amount of alternatives ruled out in situation, at least. So the possible worlds, its utterance, its force of. So Hesperus is identical with Phosphorus. We know that given that it's a fact in all possible worlds, so the sentence is true and not false of all possible worlds. So it's true in all possible worlds, true of all possible worlds. So it seems that on that possible world semantics, no possible worlds are ruled out. So isn't that uninformative? But we do learn a fact about the world when we know that Hesperus is identical with Phosphorus. So there's a problem. And Stalnaker talks about semantic fact. And what is metasemantics? So let's say the historical fact that determined a semantic, that's the metasemantic fact. The metasemantics is constituted by how semantic is constituted, especially by historical fact. So the history could have been different, such that Mars occupies the actual astronomical position of Hesperus, as in the counterfactual world. Then in that counterfactual world, the reference of the word Hesperus, the name Hesperus, will be determined differently. And that's metasemantics, because, well, we talk about how a semantic of a name, a semantic reference, how it is determined and how it depends on historical fact. So when we think about metasemantics and the metasemantic interpretation of Stalnaker's two-dimensional framework, we would notice that Hesperus is identical with Phosphorus. That's a sentence that would have ruled out worlds with alternative semantic, because given that Hesperus is identical with Phosphorus, holding everything else fixed, that sentence would have, well, because Hesperus is identical with Phosphorus. So if Mars were to occupy Hesperus' actual position, this sentence would have been used to utter a falsehood, and the world that it's false of would have been ruled out. So those are the worlds that are ruled out, such as WC, the counterfactual world. But notice that, yeah, worlds with alternative semantic, or worlds with alternative semantic fact, yeah, they're ruled out, but Stalnaker is not giving a metalinguistic theory, because speakers like Peter or Paul, Mary, they could have used the sentence without going metalinguistic, right? They're just using the sentence and told Peter that, no, Hesperus is identical with the Phosphorus, so you got it wrong, without going one level up to and going metalinguistic. They don't need that. So it's a metasemantic interpretation of the two-dimensional framework. So we saw that we're talking about counterfactual reference. Counterfactually, so Hesperus is identical with Mars. Given that Mars instantiate Hesperus and Phosphorus actual restricted spatial temporality, that's not WC that I mentioned, it's another counterfactual world, because at WC, I haven't mentioned it, but the fact that varied, we held the fact about Venus occupying the morning sky in a certain position fixed, but now even that is varied, because now is both Mars occupies both position in the evening and in the morning. So in that counterfactual world, not only Hesperus would have a counterfactual reference that's distinct from the actual reference in the world, even Phosphorus would have a counterfactual reference. And then these two names would have the co-reference to Mars. And Hesperus is identical with Mars, would have uttered truth, right? And I think that's a problem for Stalnaker's two-dimensional theory. It seems that even though his theory ruled out worlds like WC, it doesn't rule out worlds that are more radical, more to use David Lewis' term, more distant from the actual world, when Mars occupies both positions instead of Venus. That seems to be a world in which the metasemantics interpretation would not have ruled out that world as to use of Stalnaker's term, the diagonal proposition. The diagonal proposition includes this world. And so as we saw that in actuality, we could have semantic competence and use the word to refer to the object with following the reference from before, without the epistemic performance, because we might not be able to identify the actual reference. So, but then Stalnaker, he went beyond that and bring in counterfactual reference instead of only actual semantic actual semantic competence. That's of course with the actual semantic reference. So here's my theory of epistemic content. So epistemic sense, that's to have an epistemic theory of Fregean sense. So sense, it is the way an object is given to an epistemic agent and therefore to a speaker. Venus is given one way in the evening and another way in the morning. Well, in virtue of that, it's in the evening and in the morning. That distinguishes the way Venus is given, and it's given differently. And we used different names when we do that. And the epistemic difference in how they're given, because the givenness is how the object, being the way it is epistemically inputted to us. So that difference in givenness, that epistemic difference explains the pragmatic difference, and that's how I would do that. And that's without semantic difference, because to use Quine's notion of opacity, I don't think it's opaque. I think we still have direct referentiality, and even to for Kripke, he doesn't want to give up substitutivity, but he raises the question of whether in belief context it works the same. But now I hold fixed that it's still direct reference. It's just that the epistemic difference makes that difference in pragmatic context without any semantic difference. So it's very simple. So in different epistemic contexts, when people have different evidence or maybe seeing Venus differently, when you see Venus being bright and you think, and when you know that Venus is bright, when you know it in the evening and when you know it in the morning, it's the same. You would have expressed the propositional knowledge in the same way, that Venus is bright, but what you're thinking is different. The situation you're in, the difference in epistemic context would have made a difference to the epistemic content of the propositional knowledge that's typically expressed as Venus is bright. So it's in a way that's very simple and commonsensical, but that's how I think is at work. And here's my epistemic counterpart theory. So epistemic indistinguishability. So let's say Mars in that counterfactual world, WC, is an epistemic counterpart to Hesperus in the actual world, because given evidence, let's say Peter's evidence, Mars in that counterfactual world is epistemically possibly Hesperus, because given his evidence, he can't determine whether or not it is not. Well, he can't determine that it is not. Well, maybe it is. So that's the epistemic possibility given given his observation, given his past experience, given what he's learned, given his evidence. He can't tell Mars in that counterfactual world. He can't distinguish that from the actual Hesperus. So Mars is an epistemic counterpart. Mars in that world is an epistemic counterpart. So that world, when we talk about Hesperus, is an epistemic possibility relative to Peter. But for Paul, he has more evidence. So his evidence determines that world, Mars in that world, as an epistemic impossibility of Hesperus. So Hesperus might not be Mars. So that's Paul. An epistemic accessibility, that's epistemologic. When we have more evidence, and of course we have to use the evidence in the right way, that's when we increase the epistemicity of our epistemic state. When we have more evidence, consider Peter. If he were to learn more about astronomy after acquiring more evidence, there will be less non-identical epistemic counterparts, because Mars in the counterfactual world, see, that's a non-identical epistemic counterpart because it's not identical to Venus, but it is an epistemic counterpart. So once you learn more about the actual world, then you would have eliminated, ruled out more such epistemic possibilities, and there will be less and less non-identical epistemic counterparts. And in the end, when you know, that's when only the original object, Venus, that's epistemically indistinguishable from the original object, because epistemic accessibility, it's reflexive. So of course you can't tell the difference between an object in that world from that object from in that world, because it's indistinguishable, because it's well, indiscernible, because it instantiates all properties, because that's the same object in the same world. So once you know about the object with regard to a certain property, then you can distinguish all alternatives. At least that's in the that's supposed to be in the epistemic context. So cognitive science, because cognitive science, cognition, it's the following is a little bit provocative, but because the way we use it, the science, we talk about information, but then to go back to Stalnaker's query, whether Peter's belief carry any information, I think that it's our knowledge of his belief that carries information. It's our epistemic state that encode information, and it encodes information about the world, because what Peter believes is a fact in the world. But Peter's belief in itself, it only has an illusion of information. So cognitive science, if it studies cognition and belief fact about psychology, I want to distinguish an actual study of information processing and otherwise. So Stalnaker has this quote in his 1974 paper that some do semantics and pragmatics by throwing away things that they can't solve semantically to pragmatics. And some may be suspicious that Stalnaker is setting up a pragmatic waste basket and recommending that all the interesting problems be thrown away. Yeah, his pragmatic strategy is trying to solve something pragmatically, but I think what underlies his solution is an epistemic solution to the necessary a posteriori to knowledge of identity. So he did not exactly throw it away. It's just that it's not pragmatics that's at work, but it's epistemology. So here it is. I talk about Stalnaker on belief ascription and inconsistent beliefs from Kripke, knowledge of identity, and then I bring out my theory. Thank you very much.